Good morning or good afternoon. Thank you again for joining us today for part 2 of Colliers Retail Webinar Series, The Current Impact of COVID-19 on the Restaurant Sector. I'm Angie Solanki, National Director of Retail Services for the U.S. with Colliers International. We have all witnessed and are experiencing significant disruptions to business and the impact on life itself. Today's topic is personally challenging. The food movement has touched us in one way or another through celebrations, social gatherings, and learning new cultures through food. It's really part of our everyday life. The people who created these memorable journeys for us cannot be forgotten. So let's all do our part and support however possible. Today, we'll be speaking to Taylor Ricketts and Alan Lee with Creditntell, who will discuss the challenges, the financial runway, and how F&B is navigating through the current landscape of food. And before I hand the mic over to Taylor, a few things to note. We do have quite a few people. I think we're hitting today close to 800 people who are joining in and listening to this broadcast. So hopefully you can see the information and the presentation on the device. This presentation and the recording will also be shared with you after, most likely today or tomorrow at the latest. In addition to that, we've also muted all of the lines. However, you can ask a question through the Q&A button on the screen. We also want to thank those who shared questions in advance of this call, with the majority asking about the various things that we may see in terms of the impact to restaurants, independent restaurants, timing of when they may be able to reopen, etc. We'll be addressing these questions and others during the presentation. So Taylor, with that, I'm going to have you introduce yourself as well as Alan and Creditntell. Please take it from here.
Thanks, Angie. So quick introduction. My name is Taylor Ricketts. I'm joined today by my colleague, Alan Lee. We're part of a broad credit consulting service covering all retail sectors through our two companies, Creditntell and F&D Reports. Alan is our expert on restaurants, and I primarily cover the broader food sector. Combined, Alan and I have nearly 20 years experience. However, I think it goes without saying that the last month has been unprecedented and eye-opening for all of us. We are thankful to be able to join you today to share a bit of what we are seeing, how COVID-19 is impacting restaurants, how operators are responding, and a bit of where we think this is going. So with that, we just turn the slide.
Great. So let's kick this off, and maybe Alan, you can share with us, what is the situation today? We've already heard over the last few weeks, whether we're here in the US or other countries, that the restaurant sector has really been hit the hardest. But there's also been some creative ways too that some of these restauranteurs are trying to combat. So maybe you can just share a little bit about current situation and what you're experiencing in the marketplace.
Thanks, Angie. So next slide, please. So yes, it has been a very eventful last couple of weeks for the country and for restaurants in particular. The kind of disruption and the sheer scale we have seen has been unprecedented. In the span of a few weeks, we've seen nearly all states suspend or restrict dine-in service, and even within the handful of those that haven't, certain of their cities have done so. So this has clearly become a nationwide concern, and even those states that have relatively low numbers of infections right now are going to eventually be greatly impacted. Next slide, please. So this chart shows consumer thoughts on going out to restaurants in early March. It's a little bit dated now, but I believe they speak to the acceleration of the sentiment. Even before the dining closures, you can see how the number of people saying that they would likely decrease how often they go to restaurants spiked in the course of a week, from 32% on March 6th to 53% on March 13th. Now, on a silver lining, there's a corresponding increase in people saying that they're more likely to order delivery, going from 13% to 25%, which makes sense because people were being warned to socially distance from each other. Next slide, please. The National Restaurant Association recently conducted a survey, and based on the results, they are estimating that from March 1st to March 22nd, nationwide restaurant sales are down 47%. Now, their estimate is that this represents $25 billion in sales loss, which is based on a projection that the restaurant industry would reach $899 billion in sales for the full year. The survey indicates that with the suspension of dine-in service, 54% of restaurant operators have switched to an off-premise model only, meaning delivery, carry-out, and drive-through. 44% of operators have temporarily closed, and then 3% have closed permanently. That could represent as many as 30,000 restaurants. Most alarmingly, however, is that 11% of operators said that they may also have to close permanently within 30 days if conditions continue or worsen. Now, the president just a few days ago extended his guidelines, which include recommending people not go to restaurants or bars through at least the end of April. That's 30 days right there. Technomic, which is a food service research company, is estimating that restaurant industry sales will decline at least 11% to 27% for the year. That's based on a shutdown that ends in mid-May. At this point, mid-May seems a little bit optimistic, but no one really knows. The bottom line is that the longer this goes on, the more restaurants are going to fold. Next slide, please. So here's a little look at the operators that have provided recent data. The charts here show comparable restaurant sales for Darden and J. Alexander's. Now, Darden operates the Olive Garden banner, as well as Longhorn Steakhouse and a few fine dining banners, while J. Alexander's sells contemporary American food, and they have a few steakhouses as well under different names. Just a note here, Darden's chart is weekly, and J. Alexander's is monthly, going from January to March. In either case, you can see the drop-off is sudden and extreme. Darden goes from low single digits at the beginning of March, slight declines in the next week, and then nearly 20% drops in the third week. Management noted that when they released these results, they were in the middle of the fourth week, but comps were already down 60% there. J. Alexander's is a similar story. They go from a slight decline from January to February before a complete freefall in March to down 25%. Now, both of these companies operate full-service restaurants, so they're appealing to the sit-down crowd. Obviously, sales are going to drop if you close dine-in services for them. But I want to clear up a misconception that I've seen in some circles. Next slide, please. It's not just casual dining that's taking a hit, it's all restaurants. Quick service restaurants, QSR, which you might expect to be doing better, are also facing severe traffic declines. Wendy's reported 4% comparable sales growth in January and February, but that's flipped to a 20% decline in the week ended March 22nd. Yum Brands, which includes KFC, Taco Bell, and Pizza Hut, estimates that their 1Q comparable sales are going to be down in the mid to high single digits, and 2Q comps are expected to be worse than that. Now, Yum has relatively more closures than Wendy's at about 1,000 Pizza Hut Express locations in the US, but most of their closures are international. So why is this happening? It's really a matter of opportunity. Those everyday opportunities for people to stop by a restaurant are drying up. Office workers are working from home. The food in the fridge is a lot closer than driving to a fast food restaurant. And public spaces are closed. Major events have been canceled. To that end, people are just going to grocery stores. They're stocking up. If you're trying to limit your contact, it just makes more sense to go to a grocery store once a week rather than a restaurant every day or two. And now that people have stocked up, they have to eat all that food. The food supply chain is running with little to no issues right now. The trucks are still on the road, they're still delivering. All those grocery stores with out of stocks you may have seen on the news, they're getting resupplied. It's just a matter of adjusting to the higher demand. So down the line, once people have seen that there's no rush for food, once they've eaten through the panic buying they've done, they may reconsider going back to restaurants. But in the meantime, these restaurants are going to have to deal with a fraction of the volumes that they normally see. Next slide, please. As a side note, what we're seeing in the US now is similar to what happened in China earlier this year. For reference, Starbucks in January temporarily closed more than half of its 4,300 stores, and they reduced operating hours at the ones that remained open. Combined with some planned closures for Chinese New Year, the peak closure rate reached 80%, and February comparable sales were down 78%. Now on the bright side, as of March 5, 90% of those stores were open, and then that number increased to 95% by March 24. And on average, those stores were closed for 45 to 60 days. That said, second quarter comparable sales in China are still expected to be down 50%. So even if this is over in the US by the end of May or June, don't expect there to be a rush back into restaurants immediately. There'll still be that lingering fear. The CEO of Starbucks, Kevin Johnson, said that the US is tracking in a very similar way to China, but it may take a week or two longer period to see the recovery. One other thing to note is that Starbucks initially closed dine-in areas in the US, but they allowed people to come to order at the counter. That was discontinued on March 20th when they switched to an only delivery and drive-through model, with the exception of a few locations that are serving healthcare workers. We may end up seeing more companies with drive-thrus follow that pattern. Next slide, please. To maybe illustrate why Starbucks did that, we have this chart here that we were able to create using data from Thasos. So Thasos is a geolocation company. They track visitor traffic using mobile cell phone data. This chart represents only the tri-state area of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. You can see the sudden drop there on March 21st, as traffic was down 40% on both a year-over-year and weekly basis. Even down 40%, that means 60% of traffic is still going there. So that may have been a reason why Starbucks decided to just close the counter service completely. Next slide, please.
Ellen, that's great information. So, you shared a little bit about different companies or Starbucks specifically adjusting their business model to address the current landscape. So what are restaurants doing? What else are they doing to survive during this time?
That's a good question, Angie. Next slide. Really, the name of the game right now is maximizing liquidity. Because we don't know how long this is going to last, and because switching to an off-premise model is such a drastic change for some of these companies, they really want as much financial flexibility as they're going to get. The first way they're doing this is tapping their revolving credit facilities. Basically, any company with a revolver is going to be drawing on it. Here are a bunch of examples, and in most of these cases, the company is drawing all the availability they can. McDonald's is probably the one exception, because even after borrowing $1 billion, they still have another $3.5 billion in availability. On the other hand, Texas Roadhouse drew all the $190 million it could. Same thing with Shake Shack at $50 million. One thing to note here is that for the franchisors listed here, McDonald's, Yum, liquidity for the franchisor doesn't necessarily translate to liquidity for their franchisees. We'll be discussing some of the steps that franchisors are doing to help them, but these drawings right here are on a corporate level. So Cheesecake Factory, for example, is 100% corporate owned, so that $90 million is going to their operations directly. Another point I want to make here is that a revolver isn't the company's only source of liquidity. It's just one of the most readily available sources. For example, Yum Brands is actually issuing over $1 billion in senior notes this week. Next slide, please. The flip side is reducing cash outlays as much as possible. We're seeing this being done on multiple levels, on a restaurant level, on a corporate level. For the restaurant level, this mainly revolves around reducing headcounts. So labor costs are typically about a third of a restaurant's operating costs. So companies are trying to reduce that piece of the pie as much as they can. Closing dine-in service means that a significant portion of those workers have been furloughed. We're seeing that companies are retaining their store managers and a small amount of hourly workers, basically just to operate the takeout business. And even for some of those hourly workers that are retained, they're even increasing their wages a little bit, kind of like hazard pay. So Cheesecake Factory, they furloughed 41,000 workers, about 91% of their staff, while J. Alexander furloughed 3,400 workers, about 81%. Cheesecake Factory is also a good example of companies reducing pay. So I just mentioned that the hourly staff might get a little bump if they're retained, but that's not the same for their corporate staff. Cheesecake Factories employs a couple thousand corporate workers and bakery workers, and they're seeing their wages cut 10 to 20%. And of course, many executives are taking similar cuts or foregoing their salaries entirely. On the restaurant level, food costs run anywhere from 25 to 40% of their operating costs. And what we're seeing some restaurants do is that they're simplifying their menus, basically just trying to reduce complexity as much as they can. McDonald's, for instance, discontinued their all-day breakfast. Now, on a corporate level, we're seeing companies suspend dividends and repurchases entirely. And at the same time, they're limiting their capital expenditures to just what's needed to maintain the restaurant and the equipment. That means new unit growth looks to be near non-existent in the short term. Any stores currently under construction will probably be delayed. For example, J. Alexander is negotiating to delay 2 restaurants that they had initially planned to open later this year. And the other big question is rent. Cheesecake Factory was somewhat unique in announcing that they would not pay April rent in a press release, but pretty much every retailer or restaurant operator is going to be having these discussions with landlords. Taylor will go into this a little bit later when we're discussing the recent government stimulus bill. Now, putting all this together, few companies have given a time frame for how long they can continue their operations, mainly because traffic has been so volatile and it's hard to estimate when there's that kind of volatility. J. Alexander is one. They estimate that their current liquidity of about $26 billion is enough to last them until late summer to early fall. Next slide, please. Now, Darden is another case. They provide an estimate that if all their stores had to close, meaning not even any off-premise sales, they would burn $40 million to $50 million per week. At about $1 billion in liquidity after they borrowed $750 million under their revolver, that gives them a decent runway, a couple of months. But Darden is pretty well capitalized. They're in it for the long haul. Ultimately, not all restaurants are going to have that kind of strength right now, especially independents. One other example that I wanted to mention here is Cracker Barrel and Punch Bowl Social, because it's a good example of a company making a tough choice to maintain liquidity. Cracker Barrel acquired a 58.6% stake in Punch Bowl Social in July 2019, so that's less than a year ago. Punch Bowl Social is an experiential restaurant chain. They have gaming, craft beer, and karaoke, basically just trying to appeal to the millennial crowd. They had less than 20 locations at the time, and they wanted to expand quickly, and Cracker Barrel's investment seemed pretty solid at the time. Now, on March 20th, we've heard that Punch Bowl Social has closed all its locations. They laid off essentially all their employees, and they even defaulted on their secured credit facility. The lenders gave Cracker Barrel the option to pay or assume Punch Bowl Social's debt, but Cracker Barrel just refused. They opted to take an impairment charge on their entire equity stake instead. Basically, it seems like cold hard math here. Punch Bowl Social is supposed to be a growth vehicle for them, and they're not really going to be seeing a lot of growth in the near future. Next slide, please.
Alan, that was actually really fascinating about, these challenges and how hard decisions need to be made. To your point, these experiential concepts in restaurants that were just on its upward swing have now had to make some really tough decisions. So with that, which sectors do you see that are going to continue to be the most vulnerable, but also those that are best positioned? You just identified 2, but what else is going on out there?
Yes, next slide, please. So yeah, to preface the discussion, we have to talk about off-premise. I've mentioned it a few times, but it's basically at the core of it, it's the takeout, delivery, and drive-through business of a restaurant. It also includes catering, but that's typically pretty small right now. For all restaurant sales, it's estimated that off-premise represents about 50 to 60%, but the percentages vary heavily by sector. On the far right of the range here, you can see you have your QSR. These are heavy off-premise, particularly drive-through, and they typically do over 70%. The Wendy's does about 80%, but Jack in the Box goes as high as 90%. After that, you have the fast casual. They're more varied, but also pretty high at over 50%. Noodles & Company has leaned into off-premise a lot in recent years, and they're at about 58%. And a company like Chipotle is probably even higher than that. Then you have the casual dining sector, which has been losing a lot of traffic to the fast casual chains. Even though some of these companies are leaning into off-premise, there are many that don't. So the percentage for these is often between 10 and 20%. Applebee's is only at 13%. And then finally, you have fine dining, which is probably the antithesis of off-premise. If they do offer it, they usually don't market that they do. Ruth's Chris is an example here, but the whole sector is probably less than 5% off-premise. Of course, these percentages are under normal conditions, they're likely to change a lot. Next slide, please. So who's going to do the best? Pretty much what you might expect. It's the high off-premise and the delivery-friendly concept. They're the best position. So while traffic and, well, we mentioned before, Wendy's and Yum, they're down in the short term, these are the ones that are more likely to turn it around. Pizza delivery is kind of unique in this space. A concept like Papa John's or Domino's, they didn't really have any dine-in to lose. They're so delivery focused in the first place. And collectively, these three companies, Pizza Hut, Papa John's, and Domino's, are hiring 60,000 workers. There are plenty of laid off retail and other restaurant workers that can fill these roles. Now, in contrast, the low off-premise concepts are going to generate a fraction of their previous sales. J. Alexander's, which we've mentioned a few times now, expects to only generate 10 to 20% of historical sales whilst operating on a carry-out model. And we're seeing similar sentiments from other casual dining. Also, these sales are going to be at lower margins too, which will put even more pressure on them. Next slide, please. On top of this, there are plenty of restaurant operators that were struggling before the COVID-19, and this may push them over the edge. So Steak and Shake, last year they temporarily closed 107 restaurants, and I put temporarily in quotation marks because the plan was to refranchise them over a 3-year period, and who knows what might actually occur now. Steak and Shake doesn't maintain a revolver, and their comps are down 6.9% last year. Boston Market, they abruptly closed 10% of their store base in June and July last year. And then California Pizza Kitchen and NPC International, they've both been dealing with heavy debt burdens. NPC in particular has been really struggling. They missed an interest payment in January, and they were negotiating with lenders about a possible bankruptcy in February. NPC is kind of notable because they're this country's largest Pizza Hut and Wendy's franchisee, with 1,200 Pizza Huts and about 400 Wendy's. And I just want to note again, these are just the imminent ones that we know about. There's likely to be a lot more as this persists. Next slide, please.
So with that, Alan, what support are restaurants receiving? Is there assistance? You shared a little bit earlier on during the call, government assistance, but what else is going on? How else can we support?
Right. So understandably, restaurants are looking for whatever help they can get, wherever they can get it. For franchisees, this means looking to the franchisor first. So we're seeing several avenues that the franchises are going down to provide this kind of support. The easiest one is to defer remodeling and new unit obligations. Typically, franchisees have, as part of their agreement, they have to remodel every couple of years, and they have to open a new unit every couple of years, something like that. Yum Brands, Wendy's, they've just pushed those out about a year each, and I'm sure they could address it later if they had to. The next one is deferring the royalty and the ad fund payments, the advertising fund payments. Now, franchisees typically pay 4% to 6% royalties, and then another 2 to 4% for these advertising fees. There's a lot of variance here in how franchisors are addressing this. Some of them are reducing rates. For example, you look at Subway, they reduced the royalty payments from 8% to 4%, though that was only for 1 week, while other ones are providing grace periods or just extending the terms. For example, Wendy's, they're extending terms for royalty and ad fund payments by 45 days for 3 months. The same is true for rent deferrals. A lot of these franchisers are basically landlords. McDonald's is considering rent deferrals. Wendy's is deferring base rent by 50% for 3 months. Restaurant Brands International, which is not on the slide here, but they operate Burger King, Tim Hortons, and Popeyes. They changed their rent structure from fixed plus variable to 100% variable, so it'll scale with restaurant sales better. Now, it's important to note here that these are all really just delays. For rent in particular, which independents are also going to struggle with, just deferring the payment itself for a few months is little more than a Band-Aid here. These restaurants have lost weeks worth of sales, and for many of them, these were critical weeks. A concept like Buffalo Wild Wings, they missed out on all their March Madness sales. By the end of this, they might have lost a few months of sales. And given the thin margins that they run on, it may be impossible to pay a full year's rent, even if you spread it out. What we've seen some operators do is they're requesting the rent be deferred and spread out over the length of the lease maybe, or maybe even just extend the lease and just tack on the months at the end. Next slide, please. One more place that restaurants are finding support is from third-party delivery companies. So these are the four major ones: Grubhub, Uber Eats, DoorDash, and Postmates. Many companies already have partnerships with these operators, but the tension between the operators and the deliverers has grown in recent years as delivery has become more widespread, more accepted. Delivery fees can run pretty high as 30% in some areas, and that just kind of eats away at all the margins in the first place. We're seeing the larger delivery companies try to entice these independents to sign up by deferring their commissions and fees, similar to how the franchisors are deferring royalty and ad fund payments. This kind of runs into the same problem that we just discussed. If operations don't improve, or even if they do, but not enough, and then these deferred fees all hit at once a couple of months later, it just may not be workable for a restaurant to stay open. If you're an independent and you're trying to estimate if this will even work out for you, if it's even profitable to operate, you may be better off just temporarily shutting down. Next slide, please.
So building on this, and I think this is where restaurants can start breathing at least a small sigh of relief. Last week, the U.S. government passed a $2 trillion stimulus package. A few key provisions as they impact restaurants. First is this income floor for individuals. Basically, these are direct payments of $1,200 for individuals, $2,400 for couples, and an extra $500 per child. These are, of course, phased out for higher earners, but the overall effect of this is that it puts dollars in the pockets of most Americans, which should help stabilize parts of the economy, including restaurant sales, during this period of incredible downturn. Secondarily, the Treasury now has broad authority to issue loans to large businesses. Though it's not clear what the details of these rules are surrounding these loans, obviously if you're one of the larger operators in the space like a Darden, this is where you would appeal to get financing to help weather this storm. And lastly, and most significant for most restaurants, is the small business support. So this applies to businesses of less than 500 employees, and for reference, 70% of all restaurants are single unit, 90% have fewer than 50 employees. So obviously, we're casting a very wide net in the restaurant world with a 500 employee maximum. And this support is primarily twofold. First are the SBA loans. These are calculated as a total of the lesser of $10 million, or 250% of an average monthly payroll. And the key provision here is that loans are forgivable for amounts paid for wages, benefits, rent, utilities, basically all the major non-food expense buckets for a restaurant. Said differently, though this is a loan, this is really a grant which will cover 2 months of losses for most restaurants. The second provision is the payroll tax credit, which is equivalent to 50% of payroll taxes, or up to $10,000 per employee. However, due to the benefits of the first provision, the SBA loans, I think that's really the avenue most restaurants are going to take. So turning the page, I think it's important to point out that even if operators survive and weather this period of significant contraction, the macro environment on the other side of this is likely to be much worse than it was in 2019. We expect to be continuing with much higher levels of unemployment, ongoing market uncertainty. We could easily be in a recession on the other side of this. Additionally, there could be lingering fears to eating out or even going out, as Alan mentioned, China is still experiencing. Lastly, the operators that survive are likely to be much more burdened with debt from leaning into their balance sheet during this downturn, which will make for a challenging situation, especially if we emerge in a recession. Additionally, we consider it likely that some of the behavioral changes occurring now will stick. Telecommuting will become more commonplace. There's likely to be less corporate travel. Both of these negatively impact restaurant sales as they create lower opportunities for service, especially in the higher end. Turning the page and pulling all this together, COVID has decimated the restaurant sector. QSR, which is doing the best, is down at least 20%. Fine dining is down near 100%. And this is expected to persist at least another 30 days, if not a good bit longer. Operators are doing everything they can to buy time right now. They're borrowing revolvers, they're furloughing employees, they're deferring rent to preserve cash, but that's all they're really doing. They're just buying time. At this point, there's no indication of when the recovery will occur and what that will look like. The government stimulus passed just last week is a welcome change of pace for restaurants. And I think it's important to point out that we are still in the early phases of this, and we're likely to see more stimulus in the future, further benefiting restaurants. That said, some companies have already closed their doors and more will likely follow. It is impossible to look past the financial toll this is taking on the sector right now. Lastly, the survivors from this are going to be permanently weakened due to increased debt. Many have missed the key selling seasons, including opportunities to connect with their customers. And all of this will be further exacerbated if we emerge in a recession where consumers are more stingy with their wallets and thus less likely to patron the restaurants.
Taylor and Ellen, thank you so much. We do have a couple quick questions. Taylor, here's one for you that came in through our audience. The question is related to the stimulus bill, and it was specific to if you have any breakdown as it relates to how this may, layer down to municipalities. Will there be additional support, do you think, from local municipalities that will help and maybe cover, stimulus is 2 months. Is there potential that we can get additional dollars from local government to support and continue that?
Yeah, so first of all, absolutely, is the answer to that question. So states and local governments are receiving a significant piece of this pie, 15% give or take. And though some of that's earmarked for health uses, a lot of it's not allocated at all. So yeah, there will be local stimulus. I can't really speak to any specific examples yet, but local stimulus to help support these local economies because, obviously that's where it's being felt.
Another question, Taylor, for you is if the payroll tax credit is 50% of wages up to $10,000 or so, does that mean it's $10,000 per employee?
Yes. And, if you're kind of looking at these two as they're or options here, you can't take both. The payroll tax credit provides immediate cash flow. You immediately can defer paying that payroll tax, which is probably, it's the major advantage of taking that route right now, where the SBA loans, though they're trying to accelerate and pull out the roadblocks, you're still working with the SBA, which is a quite onerous environment. And I haven't heard anyone actually writing SBA loans yet. And I know locally, I've talked to my local bankers, and they're saying this is still weeks out.
Thank you. How about from the private equity groups? A question came in specific to that. They're significantly leveraged on the restaurant side of the business. Are there any chains owned by private equity that you see running into significant liquidity issues?
We did mention a few of them in the presentation. California Pizza Kitchen, they're owned by Golden Gate Capital. They've been struggling before this, and they may run into the same liquidity issues there. Boston Market as well.
Okay.
I think
Okay.
another piece to that, there was an interesting article the other day quoting Leon Black and Apollo, where they're basically talking about the incredible deals in the marketplace. Kind of putting your Warren Buffett hat on. If you have a long-term view of this, you can make some very advantageous acquisitions. So So yes, there are some suffering with debt that really maybe the model wasn't quite right before. There are going to be other opportunities where we're going to probably see PE swoop in there to acquire and do some M&A on the cheap because everything's depressed right now.
Right, right. Now, there's another question, because we're required to social distance ourselves in different scenarios and restaurants being a gathering place, a social environment, do you see post COVID-19 on day 2, will there be a redesign of some of these restaurants in terms of just seating, flow, etc.? I've had this conversation myself with a few designers, with some global firms, and I think what we're hearing from these designers and architects is that the answer is yes. Some companies are already implementing or allocating capital to create hands-free. But what's your opinion on that?
Well, that's an interesting point because it kind of ties into this growth of off-premise as a whole. Even before COVID-19, a lot of companies are trying to lean into this, and that includes things like developing digital kiosks, pickup shelves for online orders, a lot of these things that basically just reduce the friction between a consumer making an order and then taking it. And I think that a lot of companies are going to try to redesign to make that more possible, and they can use that kind of as an advertising thing just to push it. Say that you don't have to interact with other people to get your food.
Right, right. No, it completely makes sense. There's definitely a lot of questions around, I think the aspect of, it's a domino effect, right? So you have government support. Hopefully there's going to be lender support, et cetera. And so some of the questions that we're reading through here live is, are lenders going to provide consideration to landlords who are offering any sort of deferment of rent? I don't know if you've heard anything on the lending side as of yet. Because right now, notes and deeds do not carve out for municipal moratoriums on rent or evictions.
Yeah, that's a very important question, much broader than just restaurants. I mean, you think of mall traffic, et cetera. I haven't seen definitive answers on that kind of question yet.
Yeah, same here. We're kind of hearing everything is on hold at the moment. Since it's changing on a rapid and daily basis. We just heard this morning that the Virginia market is shelter in place or stay at home through early June. And so that particular market may be impacted far more than maybe other markets if we're able to go back to somewhat of the new norm in our daily lives after April. So yeah, there's still too much going on in the marketplace in different markets from both state level to the federal level. So I think the topic here is that, or the point I'm trying to make is that we really need to continue this dialogue and the conversation that we're doing right now and discussing these different elements, because it's impacting each and every one of us. And so with that, Alan and Taylor, thank you again so much for sharing these insights in the current environment. I want to heavily preface that it's the current environment, it's changing every day. And so many of us are delivering solutions during this time, having this dialogue. So let us know if you need us to help or support, provide information. As I mentioned earlier at the beginning of this call, a recording of this call along with the deck will be provided to all who had attended. We will also provide feedback to those questions we did not answer on the Q&A today on a one-by-one cases. We'll also provide Taylor and Alan's information should you have further questions for either of them or for us at Colliers. And also please stay tuned for our next webinar. Same time, same day. The topic will be the threat of COVID-19 to our supply chains. Will our stores, will our restaurants be ready to be fully stocked and be ready to take on, hopefully what we will see is a high demand of people trying to get back to the new norm So thank you again for participating. We look forward to connecting with you next Wednesday. Again, same time, same place. Be well.